Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 12, Dialectic of Liberalism.
Non-communists have often upbraided communists for what are alleged to be gross inconsistencies in communist behavior. The charge goes as follows: you communists call for a maximum of free speech, free press, free assembly and other civil rights in the United States and other non-communist countries, but inside the countries where communists are in power you have suppressed, or virtually suppressed, all these rights. You uphold the right to strike in non-communist countries, and very often exercise that right in practice when you are in control of trade unions, but in the communist countries it is criminal, in some cases a capital crime, to strike or merely advocate striking. In the non-communist countries you call for an end to war, for disarmament and peace, and you support pacifist slogans and organizations, but inside the communist sphere no pacifist talk or pacifists are permitted and the entire economic plan is subordinated to armament, and communists give active support to many wars and rebellions all over the globe. You demand self-determination and independence for nearly any group, however short a claim it has to being a genuine nation, in Africa, the Middle East or Southern Asia, but you refuse to permit any free expression of national opinion within the nations, many of them of ancient lineage, inside your own bloc, and you send in tanks to put down the attempts to act independently. Similar examples could be multiplied to prove how you are both for and against free speech, for and against democracy, for and against peace, freedom of religion and self-determination. They all combine to show that either your official communist doctrine is a bundle of crass contradictions, or you communists are hypocritical liars, saying one thing with one side of your mouths and the opposite with the other. The communist, however, is not prepared to accept either horn of that dilemma. If he is willing to admit you for a moment inside the threshold of the mysteries, he will explain as follows.
Your naive critique is only a reflection of your mental enslavement within the static framework of Aristotelian logic, which is unable to comprehend the reality of change, time and history. One more proof, by the way, that your way of thinking, like your world in general, is doomed to early extinction. If you were able to understand the historical dialectic, which, since you are not a communist, you cannot really do, only the living practice of communism makes possible a genuine understanding of the theory of communism, you would realize that there are no inconsistencies. In every case the seeming contradictories, in the reality of time and history, reinforce each other and fuse their dynamism into a synthesis at a higher historical level. The communist camp is the thesis which represents the historical interests of the revolution, therefore of peace, freedom, justice, well-being, and the future of mankind in the coming epoch of a truly human history. Anything that strengthens the communist camp is right and just and good. In the present transitional era of world struggle, of wars and revolutions, the use of civil rights inside the communist camp to publicize opposition to the line of the party and the revolution would only express the intrusion of counter-revolutionary influences, of capitalist hangovers and imperialist interventions. The proper purpose of public speech and assembly is to support, strengthen and improve the work of the revolution, not to sabotage it. Similarly, labor organization has the function of enabling the workers to contribute the maximum to the building of the revolution, not to tearing it down, besides which, strikes would be in any case an anachronism in a communist country, because it is the workers themselves through their revolutionary state, not capitalists and monopolists, who own the machines and factories. Since we still live in a world where the forces of reaction and imperialism are rampant and are daily plotting to drown the revolution in blood, our camp must be armed to the highest possible level precisely in order to serve the cause of peace, which is the cause of the revolution, and every blow struck in an anti-colonial revolt, or in a war for independence and liberation fought against an imperialist power or a reactionary social class, is a blow for peace. But to permit parts of the already communist, that is, truly liberated, region to break away under the alleged claim to the right of self-determination would be to surrender to the counter-revolutionary intrigues of the imperialist warmakers.
Exactly the same reasoning applies to the non-communist camp except, of course, in reverse.
The non-communist camp represents the historical interests of the class oppressors and the counter-revolution, therefore of war, tyranny, poverty and the bloody, reactionary past and present of society only half lifted from barbarism. Anything that weakens the non-communist camp is right and just and good. Since free speech and assembly and other civil rights are useful for the operations of the revolutionary vanguard within the enemy camp, and for psychological and other fission maneuvers designed to erode the enemy will and his social structure, they are to be preserved and supported, though preferably withdrawn from use by militant anti-communists. Since strikes can be exploited to weaken the non-communist economy and to advance revolutionary ideas and personnel, the right to strike is similarly correct for the non-communist camp. And, self-evidently, any weakening of the armament of the non-communist camp or of the non-communist will to use its arms, through partial or outright pacifist propaganda and activity, is right and good and desirable, within the enemy's sphere.
The communists dress this analysis up in all sorts of Hegelian furbelows, but fundamentally they are making a straightforward point, however it may be neglected by non-communists. The meaning of universal ideas and principles, they are saying, cannot be discovered merely by definition and abstract analysis, but only by relating them to the specific conditions of time, place and circumstance in which they function, and further, this being the peculiar insight by which communism raises this notion above the common sense level, the existential context always includes a clash, struggle or conflict of interests, forces, classes or institutions, whether or not the conflict is consciously recognized. Thus every universal idea, peace, law, freedom, democracy, justice, order, liberation, has both a plus and a minus value, dependent on which side of the given conflict is in question. Undoubtedly the communists carry this dialectical analysis of theirs to logical extremes where it becomes lost in a maze of Hegelian-style metaphysics. Leaving that for the scholiasts, we may still recognize that a moderately dialectical approach is surely called for if we are to understand what happens in the actual world that has been, is, and is likely to be for as far ahead as we need to be concerned with. But obvious as this may be when we focus attention on it, it is exceedingly difficult not to overlook it, or forget it, when we view the world through the lens of a universalistic and rationalist ideology such as liberalism. A liberal tends to feel and reason, peace is peace, free speech is free speech, law is law, democracy is democracy, justice is justice, then, now and forever, here, there and everywhere. Suppose that I am approached by an armed robber. I preach to him the virtue of disarmament, he is persuaded, and throws his gun away, and I keep my wallet. This result will be pleasing to me, and most of us will judge the outcome morally praiseworthy. Still, it can hardly be said that disarmament meant the same thing for both parties, or that the net result was an equal gain to both, though of course we both ended up disarmed. The suspicion remains that I managed to put something over on my primitive and slow-witted accoster. Change the circumstances slightly. Say that I, the good citizen, have the gun, and the would-be robber, only his 2 fists and a club, perhaps. But I don't like guns, thinking them dangerous for everyone concerned and also a barbaric way to settle disputes that ought to be dealt with rationally, by, let us say, a dialogue. So I enter into negotiations with my 2-fisted friend, and we eventually agree to disarm, mutually, of course. I throw away my gun, and he throws his club, or seems about to when I get rid of the gun to prove my good faith. Again, the result yields an abstract equality, both sides disarm. But this has no relevance to the concrete meaning of what has happened, namely, a reversal in power relationship. It should be obvious that from a practical standpoint disarmament measures, and even, through their psychological effect, mere disarmament campaigns that do not lead to specific measures, are to the relative advantage of the side that has the inferior arms, or no arms. My belief in nonviolence may spring from the purest of ideals, but if I have no weapons and you have many, it will also prove a very useful belief if I can get you to share it sufficiently to lead you to throw away your big bombs, unload your revolvers, sheath your truncheons and kennel your police dogs. The first large-scale disarmament campaign developed in the latter half of the 19th century. Its chief specific proposal was to prohibit a monstrous new weapon of annihilation, the steel-clad dreadnought. Not surprisingly, this demand was pressed most fervently by the nations of continental Europe, and resisted most firmly by Britain, which was the only country at that time equipped with the technology and industry to construct dreadnoughts. In the 20th century it became the turn of British and American opinion to campaign for the prohibition of a monstrous new weapon, the U-boat, which happened to be the only device by which Germany might have challenged Anglo-American control of the seas. All varieties of pacifism, though from the point of view of this or that individual they may rest on moral and theological beliefs, have similar connections in practice. The more my opponent is affected by pacifist ideas and feelings, the better it is for me, practically speaking. And this fact is so unquestionable that the propaganda and psychological warfare services of all modern governments have deliberately promoted pacifism among the enemy armies and civilian populations during the wars of this century. Several of the governments have included in their war preparations a preliminary sowing of pacifist ideas in prospective enemy quarters. It is a mark of the ascendancy of the liberal ideology, with its attendant guilt, in the advanced Western nations, most particularly in the United States and Great Britain, that for the first time in history disarmament proposals and pacifist-tending ideas are being pressed not by the nations with inferior arms in order to weaken the stronger, but by the stronger in order to weaken themselves, to sacrifice their relative advantage, and thereby to lessen their ability to defend their interests and ideals. True enough, the governments of the Western nations have in some measure been trapped into disarmament pacifism by the calculated manipulations of the communists and the intuitively shrewd demagogy of the Afro-Asian leaders. But quite apart from all deliberate efforts from the outside, the disarmament pacifist trend in Western opinion is also self-imposed, a derivative of the rationalist habit of understanding peace as an abstract universal instead of a concrete and dynamic condition, and of the Western sense of guilt at the immensity of its own power. Analyzed dialectically, that is, in relation to their existential and historical context, disarmament and the search for peace do not have a single, unambiguous meaning that can be established by a fixed definition. The operative meaning of such terms must be discovered in each case by relating them to the actions, interests, and goals of the person or group that is using them. When Khrushchev speaks of the struggle for peace, he is not being cynical, as many anti-communists believe. He is altogether sincere, since, for him, the struggle for peace means the fight for the worldwide victory of communism, and it is therefore consistent and natural that various sorts of coercion, violence and warfare should be included in the struggle for peace. This is not at all what Norman Cousins and the Reverend A.J. must have in mind in their struggle for peace. They are thinking, vaguely to be sure, of a state of the world in which all men, basing their conduct on their common humanity and common interests, will settle their differences by reasonable and democratic processes instead of by violence and war. And there is this additional dialectical difference between the meanings of their peace and Khrushchev's. The content that they give to the idea of peace is a figment of ideological imagination that has no relevance to the real world of space and time as it has been, is or could be, whereas Khrushchev's peace is a hard-headed program of action directly related to the world we live in. The inevitable result is that Messrs. Cousins and Must struggle for their empty dream of peace contributes in practice to the advance of Khrushchev's very realistic plan for peace. The communists divide the world into the zone of peace and the zone of war. The zone of peace means the region that is already subject to communist rule, and the label signifies that within their region the communists will not permit any political tendency, violent or non-violent, whether purely internal or assisted from without, to challenge their rule. The zone of war is the region where communist rule is not yet, but in due course will be, established, and within the zone of war the communists promote, assist and where possible lead political tendencies, violent or non-violent, democratic or revolutionary, that operate against non-communist rule. Clear enough, these definitions. You smash the Hungarian freedom fighters, and support Fidel Castro, you know where you are going. But the liberal definition of peace is clear only as an abstraction, it is muddled as soon as any attempt is made to apply it, and it obscures instead of revealing a target. Thus liberals, and the Western nations influenced by liberal modes of thought, find themselves accepting, in the name of peace, this communist division of the world into the two zones and the communist rules of conduct toward each. The burden of dissension, violence and revolt, often caused and always exploited by the communists, is borne in South Vietnam, Cuba, Katanga, Guyana, Laos, Angola, Venezuela, London and New York, for these all belong to the zone of war where violent trouble is endemic. But to avoid a threat to peace, the communists are to be left undisturbed to maintain their peace in their own way in Hungary, North Vietnam, Tibet, Russia, or wherever else in their ever-expanding zone. Liberalism defines free speech and the related freedoms of assembly and association, as it does peace and disarmament, in abstraction, without tying them to specific persons and circumstance. For liberalism, these freedoms are the procedural rules sustaining a democratic society that rests on the will of the majority and solves its internal conflicts of interest and opinion through continuous discussion, negotiation and compromise. But this meaning of free speech and the related freedoms is significant and operable only for those who share the wish or at least willingness to have and preserve some sort of free and constitutional society. For those others, and they are not few among us, whose aim is to subvert, overthrow and replace free and constitutional society, these freedoms of speech, assembly and the rest are merely convenient levers to use in accomplishing their purpose. The liberal ideologue is thus caught in the inescapable dilemma of his own making that we have previously examined. If he extends the freedoms to the subverters, they will use them, as they have done in one nation after another, to throw the free society into turmoil and in the end to destroy it. But if he denies the freedoms to anyone, he will does feel, that he has betrayed his own principles, imitated the methods of the enemy, and thus joined the company of subverters. So, when a showdown with the subverters comes, as it comes from time to all nations, the liberals are demoralized in advance, if they do finally forget ideology and decide to resist, by the guilt generated from this feeling of self-betrayal. Let us note that this is a purely ideological trap. Common sense, unlike ideology, understands that you can play a game only with those who accept the rules, and that the rules' protection does not cover anyone who does not admit their restrictions and penalties. Let us consider the dialectic of self-determination. Liberals accept, indeed actively favor and promote, self-government and independence for all peoples and nations, except, apparently, Katangans and Papuans, who want those blessings of liberty that are derived, or seem to be, from the principles of the liberal ideology. In this perspective, several score new or renewed nations have sprung into existence during the past 15 years, and now have representatives occupying much of the street-side parking space in New York and Washington. To most liberals this seems a triumph of liberalism, and it is frequently so hailed. As part of the process of gaining independence, various native leaders from the potential nations in question, many of whom have attended London University, Oxford, the Sorbonne and occasionally Columbia or Harvard, will have repeated the appropriate liberal slogans and aphorisms, sounding, especially on their tours through the United States lecture and TV circuits, like living syntheses of Locke, Jefferson and John Stuart Mill. They hire European or American professors to draw up constitutions and legal systems combining the best features of British and French parliamentarism, Anglo-Saxon common law, the Napoleonic Code and the United States Constitution. They designate themselves, at least in dispatches sent abroad, as President, Prime Minister, Premier or Cabinet member. Liberalism, the culmination and flower of Western culture, has advanced its dynamic frontier over another segment of the Earth's surface, replacing the reactionary tyranny and exploitation of colonialism, imperialism, feudal chiefdoms, and whatnot. This makes a very satisfying picture, but it is not the way things look from the other side of the wall. In fact, they look considerably different even the smallest distance behind the surface. The Revolutionary Party, group or faction in the potential new nation does, certainly, want self-government and independence. However, the revolutionaries understand self-government and independence not as shining abstractions in the liberal prayer book, but as the effective instruments of power, privilege, jobs and glory for themselves and their associates. Let us add that the independence-minded group is usually a very small minority, which is compelled to use not merely propaganda and agitation on a wide scale but in many cases a systematic terror to get sufficient backing from the wider strata of the local population. Independence for a revolutionary Arab Algeria is a great victory for human freedom, doubtless, but for the revolutionaries and their luckier followers it also means taking over the homes, shops, goods, factories, and lands of 1 million Algerians of European origin at panic prices or by simple expropriations, acquiring the farms and vineyards that the labor, skills and capital of 5 generations of Europeans have painfully raised out of the desert, getting an easy chance at the profits of the great new oil and gas wells that French scientists, engineers, geologists and money have brought into production, and not least, the satisfaction of putting the infidel dogs finally into their place as the crescent of Islam replaces the cross struck from the temples. Independence in East Africa is a dramatic achievement, and it is also the occasion when native black men, who have neither spun nor reaped, can take for nothing or next to nothing many of those splendid farms and ranches that the knowledge, effort, foresight, administrative ability and capital of Europe-sprung white men have slowly brought into being out of lands neglected and wasted for untold centuries. Not, of course, that the land of most of those farms and ranches will continue for very long to nourish the bodies and economies of those regions, as it has been laboriously taught to do. It is already being broken up into scraggly plots of yams. The Maasai will not have much time left for plowing and liming and fertilizing and spraying as their cows crop the forage to its roots to supply their diet of milk and fresh blood. An aspiring tribesman will not be concerned to number closely to the acre, in a petty white man's way, the head of cattle that prove his manliness and glory. Every observant visitor to the newly Balkanized Africa can report, though he is more likely to do so privately than in public, that the primary content of independence for many of the nationalist leaders is a car and chauffeur, a new house with servants, a bevy of mistresses, and plenty of beer and champagne consumed nightly in public competition with rivals to see who can finish with the largest number of empty bottles on his café table. Kwame Nkrumah may be Mr. Prime Minister in speeches to the United Nations, but at home his fellow citizens who wish to stay out of jail do well to remember that he is Osajyefo, the Redeemer. Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika, apple of many a liberal eye, had a law enacted requiring all vehicles going in either direction to pull to the side of the road and stop when he and his retinue of white-garbed security guards come in sight, but he insists that it is only by custom, not mandatory, that fellow citizens should bow down before him. He and Nkrumah agree with nearly all of their fellow African leaders, though the point ordinarily waits for post-independence to be mentioned, that multi-party democracy, in the Western sense, is not suitable for Africa just now. From the top of the new political pyramid, a one-party setup run by the regime in power is more the African way, and so it works out to be before long in one after another of the new African nations as it has in so many of the slightly less new Asian nations before them. It is fortunate for these newly risen potentates that they are for the most part men of the left. If they were of the right, all the furies of liberal rhetoric, we may be sure, would be thundering about their ears. Even as things are, a veteran liberal here and there can sometimes be heard swallowing hard at the report of the latest political outrage by one of these chiefs of state whom he and his fellow liberals and their common doctrine have helped boost into power. I remember when Indonesia's Sukarno visited the United States a few years ago. In a couple of university lectures and a TV hookup he told us how his life and thought were modeled on Washington, Jefferson and Lincoln, with a dash of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so he was seen and advertised by liberals as, supported jointly by Washington and Moscow, he led the battle for Merdeka against the Dutch oppressor. Liberals eagerly waited for a new America, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men of all colors are created free and equal, to arise in the South Seas. With the heavy hand of the imperialist oppressor removed, democracy would blossom. No longer exploited for the benefit of alien monopolists, the people, working now for themselves and their own country, and helped by friendly older nations, would steadily expand their domestic freedom and lift their standard of living. But Sukarno's idea of independence and Merdeka, translated from abstraction into existence, means something quite different. For him it means a Javanese imperialism, ruled by himself and his palace associates in collaboration with the world's largest communist party outside the Iron Curtain. Of course Merdeka had, and continues to have, a still different, third meaning for the Indonesian communists, and for Moscow and Peking. Westerners may do a lot of talking about opposition parties, but they are just a series of headaches for the Indonesian way of life, and will put a stop to their nonsense. Either they fall into line or we liquidate them. As for the federalism business that was written into the Constitution, it may have been a fine thing in American colonial days, but not in this part of the ocean. The function of the oil and rubber and spices of Sumatra, Celebes, and the Moluccas is to contribute to the support of Java. Any local ideas to the contrary are to be put down by machine guns and napalm. Liberal economists love to gather statistics about a rising standard of living, and doubtless it is a good plan, other things being equal, if others will pay for it, the $2 billion worth of goods stolen from the Dutch not having lasted long, but there are more important fish to fry. Too bad that the ordinary folk of Indonesia, for the first time in those islands so gently served by an abundant nature, don't have enough to eat. Our foreign exchange must be used to throw great monuments, international stadiums, cloverleaf highways, lofty hotels and public buildings, into the sky, and more particularly to assemble and maintain the planes and guns and ships to defend and expand the rising empire of the southern seas. Nor is Sukarno the only budding imperialist, as the acts as well as the words of Nasser will readily remind us. Nasser, like several other empire builders of this century, wrote down his imperial project in a small book that any literate man may read, of the New Egypt, imperial base of the overlapping rings of Araby, Islam and Africa. The revolutionary nationalist leaders understand, as liberalism does not, though some liberals are beginning to do so, that what is ending in our age is not empire but merely the empires of the West. Equality, too, becomes a less simple notion when submitted to the gloss of the dialectic. If I have $1,000 and you have none, equality means that you gain $500 and I lose $500. If I have 10 acres and you are landless, 5 are taken from me, by the principle of equality, and you get 5. But the real relation is still more disturbing. If I have enough to eat and you are starving, equality may mean that we both go hungry. Usually those of us who, adhering to the loosely defined egalitarian tendency of liberalism and thinking from the perspective of membership in a relatively affluent group, Western civilization, let us say, do not imagine equality in this rigorously mathematical way. We feel that the members of the other, less privileged group, differing in predominant color, race or religion, perhaps in distinctive culture or civilization, ought to be given equal rights and opportunities so that they will be able to follow our example, and to raise their level of life gradually to ours. To this end, and to speed up the process, we are prepared to give them help from our abundance. We omit consideration of the question why they have so notably failed, in many cases over so many millennia, to do what we look forward to their doing in the next few decades. However, this more modestly egalitarian view of ours still differs enormously from the way things look from the other side of the balance. The members of the less privileged group, or at any rate its leaders, see plainly that we have more of the good things of this world and they have less. Any sort of equalizing means, when brought down to earth, that its members, or at any rate its leaders, take over something, power, of course, and privilege as well as material wealth, of what we've got, just as quickly as the transfer can be arranged. From the perspective of the less privileged group, anything less direct is hypocritical mumbo-jumbo. This business about gradual self-development with a 5% yearly rise in gross national product is good enough for the economic historians and foreign office authors of position papers, but it doesn't put many Cadillacs in official garages or pay a newly uniformed officer corps at a rate to keep it contented. Besides, it takes too much hard work. Looking over the percentage of the world's automobiles, telephones, bathtubs, shoes, iceboxes and summer homes owned in the United States, there are a great many new revolutionary nationalist leaders who can tell you how to get Americans neatly equalized with the rest of mankind a lot faster than by minuscule donations of a few billions of foreign aid dollars annually. Nor does equality as applied to race and color escape unscathed from contact with the dialectics of reality. As liberals and at the same time members of the privileged nation, race and civilization, we are able to feel both just and generous in proclaiming the equality of all rights and liberties without respect to color, race, etc., and the end of all forms of political, economic, social or cultural discrimination. Naturally, we don't for a moment really contemplate literal equalization of their condition and ours either in our time or our children's. We have sense enough, however drugged we may be with ideology, to know more or less what that would mean, if we have been round about the world a bit or just talked to someone who has visited a while in Calcutta, Peking, Cairo, Timbuktu, or Chicago's South Side, and we know it's not for us, not unless we're saints as well as liberals. We don't mean what we say in any such crude and simple manner. We don't, but they do, those persons of those different colors, races, creeds and cultures hearing the fine-sounding principles that liberalism has formulated and taught them. And why shouldn't they take those principles to mean what they say in terms of their own lives and conditions? They have been lowly and wretched. Now, by the very invitation of the long-time lords of creation, they are to be raised up, clothed, fed, adorned and placed in the formerly reserved seats of power. And then very often, perhaps this too is natural enough, granted all the background, they go a step or two beyond even that pleasantly dialectical interpretation of equality. We tell them that all races and colors, white, black, brown, red and yellow, are brothers, are equal before the eyes of liberal doctrine in the United Nations. But some of them think they know better, that experience has taught them more accurately than abstract principles, and that its lesson has been that races, colors, creeds and civilizations are not at all alike, and maybe, now that the white Westerners, we are mostly white, it is an inescapable fact, are climbing down. It's time for asserting not the empty illusion of brotherly equality but a new reality of changed priorities in the global scale. When Nyasaland celebrated its debut in self-government on February 1, 1963, Dr. Hastings Banda, the Prime Minister, another of the African leaders educated in the West and much admired by liberal opinion, proclaimed, as the crowd rang cowbells, danced and shouted Kamuzundin Kango, Banda is a lion.
We are now a black country, in a black continent.
His conclusion does not differ in substance from that stated by James Baldwin at about the same time.
The only thing white people have that black people need, or should want, is power.
The morality play version of the trial that is a feature of many gatherings of the black Muslims carries the liberals' ideal of equality all the way through the dialectical ringer. Facing the jury representing the non-Western, non-Christian, non-white majority of the Earth's population, the prosecutor declaims,
I charge the white man with being the greatest liar on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest drunkard on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest swine-eater on earth. I charge the white man, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, with being the greatest murderer on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest adulterer on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest robber on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest deceiver on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest troublemaker on earth. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you, bring back a verdict of guilty as charged.
It requires only seconds for the foreman to announce the unanimous verdict, we find the defendant guilty, as charged, and only seconds more for the sentence of death. The 19th-century French writer Louis Vuillet summed up the general law of this political dialectic. Quand je suis le plus faible, je vous demande la liberté parce que tel est votre principe, mais quand je suis le plus fort, je vous l'ôte, parce que tel est le mien. The spare elegance of the French syntax makes this impossible to translate. The meaning is approximately, when I am the weaker, I ask you for my freedom, because that is your principle, but when I am the stronger, I take away your freedom, because that is my principle.